very welcome here today. Thank you so much for giving us the time. And we're looking forward to the discussion. For those of you who haven't been before, the series of conversations that this is part of are explorations of the idea and the importance of identity, which is in some ways quite an amorphous topic. And what we're really trying to do is to move between people's personal experience and talk to people who've had either in their life experience or in the positions that they hold some kind of perspective on identity on the island that might help us think about the future of the political future, the social future, and the cultural future of the island, whatever that might be. So Naomi is a great person to talk to because she is involved clearly in the world of politics, but she also sits at a very interesting juncture in the identity politics of contemporary Northern Ireland. We know that the Alliance vote has grown in recent years, partly down to Naomi's leadership, but it's also to do with changes in the nature of Northern Ireland, what it is and what it represents at the moment as well. And so Naomi is in a great position to talk about this. So we're going to move between the personal and the more general or the political over the discussion. We'll talk for about 45 minutes and then we'll leave time at the end for questions from the audience. So we look forward to hearing from you. So Naomi, I was reading about you saying that the Good Friday Agreement had meant that you are now more comfortable and more able to describe yourself as Irish, as British, as a woman from East Belfast, as Northern Irish. It's a lovely plural sense of identity. I was wondering how you feel, how comfortable you feel in Dublin. We're here talking to you in Dublin, and I was wondering how it feels to cross the border these days, personally, and for you as being here.
Yeah, it doesn't really affect me at all in terms of the crossing of the border. I mean, I spend a lot of time in Donegal. My husband's family have a cottage there, and we go up fairly regularly at weekends and so on. I've always spent time in Dublin, particularly we were just reflecting driving today that we haven't been in Dublin for ages at Christmas because we used to come down quite regularly, my husband and I, Christmas shopping, and just for that bit of change, somewhere a bit different. When we graduated, my husband worked for a year in Roscommon, so we would have spent a lot of time in Roscommon in the Midlands and then out in the West Coast. And so it never really mattered to me much that the border was there. It didn't really affect how I lived my life. I lived far enough away from the border that it wasn't an everyday feature, but the crossing of the border never really occurred to me as being strange. And even as a child, so I mean, I grew up during the Troubles, obviously a lot of that kind of is after the Good Friday Agreement as an adult, but even during my growing up, I remember going on kind of church holidays and things, and in Wicklow and in Sligo and so on. So it was never really alien to me. And when I'm in Dublin, like I know it well and I like Dublin, I enjoy the city. I've always said to people though, do I feel at home in Dublin? I don't know. In the same way I never felt at home in London. Because it's not my home, it's not where I live. I feel at home in Belfast, and when I'm in Belfast, that's home. But I don't feel odd or peculiar being in Dublin. I don't feel it's alien or anything like that. I enjoy the slightly bigger city. I think it's nice to be able to go somewhere that is just that bit bigger, and yet not quite as big as London, because London is just a bit too much for me. So it's... I guess I never really think about it that much. Most of the time, I have to be really honest, most of the time now I don't come to Dublin. I pass through Dublin at the airport like a lot of other people from Northern Ireland. So that's probably why I haven't spent as much time in the city of late. But I'm also here for work, so I would be up and down meeting other politicians, going to events and things like that. And it's just part and parcel of my kind of everyday life.
Okay, thanks. There's a book published this year on the Alliance Party, written by Jonathan Tongue and various other academics, and there's obviously an anonymous member of the Alliance Party quoted in that who says that they think that identity politics is a bit overrated. And I know that's not official Alliance policy, but do you think it is a bit overrated? I mean, we're here talking about the idea of, and I find in these interviews that often the people I talk to, they're absolutely fascinating people, and one of the reasons that they're fascinating and intelligent is that when we say we want to have a discussion around my identity, they step back a little bit because they think they're going to be pigeonholed or expected to speak from a position. So what's your general take on from your own point of view, and then thinking about how it works in the north at the moment?
Well, I think for me, I mean, identity, it's a very personal thing, and it's also layered. So nobody that you want to spend time with is just one thing. The people who are interested are complex people. They're people who have different layers to them and you know, different connections. So I mean, I very much do see myself as Irish. I grew up in the Church of Ireland. I became a member of Presbyterian Church in Ireland. So that was always part of the backdrop of who I was. I also grew up as British. You know, my first passport was British. That was my nationality by dint of where I was born. I'm not a natural nationalist, let's put it that way, in the sense that I don't like nationalist politics, whether it's Irish nationalism, British nationalism, any nationalism. I've always kind of felt that what you are is a kind of a fluke of where you're born. And the idea that it makes you superior to somebody else seems a bit flawed as a way to kind of do your politics. But for me, I mean, being from Northern Ireland, I also think is another layer of that identity. It is a unique experience, having lived in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, maybe less so in the future for young people growing up in that environment. But for me, I mean, there's a shared experience that we have, those of us who lived in Northern Ireland, which other people on this island and in other parts of these islands just don't share. There's also, I think, something uniquely Belfast. I mean, when I go to Derry, I'm definitely not a Derry person, and they let me know that. So, you know, and when they come to Belfast, they tell us we get everything, and you know, that's the conversation we have. But I'm not I'm definitely a Belfast person, and I'm very much an East Belfast person. That's where I was born and bred. That's where I lived my life. That's where I represent. And so when I go to West Belfast, it's not the same as East Belfast. I've spent time in all parts of Belfast and all parts of the city. When I was Lord Mayor and so on, I would have done that. But it's still very much home. And there are all those different layers, I think, to who you are. I'm still very much a European, despite the fact that they're trying very hard to stop me. I see that as a big part of my identity as well. So from my point of view, I guess, I think the problem with identity in Northern Ireland is it becomes less of an expression of who you are and more of a limit on what you can do and who you can be and how you can engage. And that's where I become worried about identity. If your identity is something that informs the decisions you make and is informed by the experience you have, then I think it's a positive thing to have a strong sense of identity, and I do. But it doesn't limit me. The fact I was born in East Belfast doesn't mean I'm going to see things the same as everybody else who lives there. And I think that's become apparent at various points in my political career, where I have taken what would be considered slightly novel takes on things. But I just think identity is a personal thing for me. Yes, it influences and it informs what I do, but it doesn't limit. My mum was a very sensible, very pragmatic woman, and she said to me, you know, people always talk about your roots, and she said roots are important, but God gave you feet because he expects you to move. And I do think we need to be willing to be flexible, to learn, to be informed. I mean, I grew up in a predominantly unionist, loyalist neighbourhood in East Belfast. It was a working class community, and pretty closed as a community. That's not who I am. It's part of how I got to be who I am, but it's only part of the story. And my views have been informed by that experience, my education, my opportunity to go to Queen's, and be in a more integrated environment, be exposed to different opinions, my opportunities to travel. All of those things have informed my thoughts now. So I think identity has to be something that there are layers to it. And I think your identity does evolve as you grow as a person. And I hope that journey continues. I wouldn't want to feel stuck at a point in time where I'm no longer capable of taking on new information or changing my mind about things, because I think that's part of the process.
And just in terms of the way that who Alliance represents in the North at the moment, there's sometimes a slight difference between the notion of a Northern Irish identity as it's kind of separate entity in a way, and then the more pluralistic and overlapping sense of identities. Is there any tension within the Alliance politics, do you think, or the way Alliance forms itself between those two views, as either a Northern Irish identity that Alliance might represent, or a multiple or overlapping sense of identity?
Not really. I mean, there will be people in the party who predominantly see themselves as British, and that would be their main identity. There will be others who predominantly see themselves as Irish. Most of them will acknowledge, the majority of people in the party will acknowledge that they're a bit of both. All of them will acknowledge that being in Northern Ireland has definitely shaped who they are, their thinking, their politics, and so on. Some will be more comfortable with the term Northern Irish than others as an identity. Some would be more, for example, in favour of having more kind of shared symbols that represent Northern Ireland in a more tangible way than some of the symbols that currently do. Others don't feel the need for that because the sort of the flags, the emblems, the symbolism stuff isn't that important to them. So yes, there'll be a diversity of opinions, but that's not really what the party is about. The party isn't about identity politics. It's not formed by people who came together because they had a single identity in mind. They came together because they had values and a vision that aligned. And so it's slightly different because other people will try and fit us into a block. For a long time, people said we were small U unionist. Then, you know, they then said, because of some decisions we made, no, they're really Republicans in sheep's clothing. And I get this a lot. I'm like Schrodinger's politician, you know, I'm simultaneously Republican and loyalist and all the rest. And it just depends on who's doing the analysis. And I think it's not about that for me. It's about how we make life better for the people that we represent. I represent people in Northern Ireland, so I'm looking at how I can make their lives better. I'm looking at how we can have better relationships, east, west, north, south. How we can be more confident in our own identity, not as a collective, but as individuals. I don't believe that identity, yes, of course, you share it with other people and there's something about identifying with other people, but I'm not sure that we always need to do these expressions as big groups. I think you need to be confident in your own identity and then you can engage with anybody.
So you were talking about growing up in East Belfast, and perhaps the majority of people who grew up in the area that you grew up in would have a very different take on identity politics than you would, and would ascribe to a particular identity and would feel comfortable in it. How do you think when you look back at your childhood, what were the factors that meant that you arrived at a different kind of politics than many of the people around you would? So most people would, through the kind of flags and emblems and all the markers of a culture that are around you, most of the people around you would have imbibed those, and they would have become part of who they were in a very particular way, and clearly that's not quite the case with you. So do you think there's something that explains that in your own story?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I'm respectful of flags and emblems and symbols, and I recognise their importance to people. I'm also wary of them being used as weapons, particularly in Northern Ireland, of them being disrespected, of disrespect for other people's symbols and culture. I'm tired of flags on lampposts marking territory and of the use and abuse of symbols. So I don't have any hostility to the tricolour or to the Union flag. Neither of them offend me at all. But I am tired seeing them abused in order to cause offence to other people and to make other people feel excluded and uncomfortable and othered, because that's not what those should be. The purpose of flags, if it's anything, is to try and bring people together, and that's not generally how they're used in Northern Ireland. I'm tired of seeing them hanging in tatters on lampposts or being burned on, bonfires or whatever it might be. So it's not that it's not that I'm not respectful of those things, I am, and they have a place. But I think in Northern Ireland, it's almost like frontier politics where you have to be more extreme in your identity to prove that you really are who you are. People are less comfortable and relaxed about who they are because it's a contested space. And I think the danger there is that we emphasise difference and division much more than seeing it as a diversity and a strength that we can celebrate, which is how I see it. I mean, if I can be both British, Irish, Northern Irish, whatever, if that isn't in conflict in me, it doesn't need to be in conflict in society. Like, if it's not tearing me apart that I'm British and Irish, why is it tearing our community apart? So I think we need to be more creative in terms of how we look at diversity and that kind of layered identity that we have. And I think there are things we can do that are positive. But yes, there are particular experiences that do stand out for me that probably did affect my politics. And one was when we had some workmen who came from the south to do work opposite where I grew up. So I grew up just off D Street in East Belfast, and they were building on a piece of land which had been essentially left after the Blitz in Belfast, because we lived quite near the shipyard and so on. So there would be these vacant sites that had been bombed during the Blitz. And they came to build some apartments. And every year, people in the street would have collected and put bunting up for the 12th and stuff, and that was fine. But this year, because of these workmen, and only because of these workmen, they were collecting money to paint the curbs of the street red, white and blue and all this, and it was quite aggressive. And my mum refused to contribute because she said the pavement didn't belong to anybody, nobody should be painting it, that it was vandalism, and she was quite vocal about it. And she was a single woman. My dad had passed away by this stage. I was in my very early teens, and she said, no, and I don't want the curbs outside my house painted, so please don't do it. Now, they had enough respect for her that they didn't. But the following morning when she got up, she looked out the window and they had painted this massive Union flag on the road outside our house with "No surrender, remember 1690. And that was a message for us, not for the workmen. And my mum was a bit taken aback, but she went on about her business. And when she went out that morning into the street, some of the other neighbours were waiting to see what the reaction would be, and they said to her, "Oh, look what's happened outside your house, Emily." And she said, and all because of these workmen from the south who will now have the joy of driving up and down over the Union flag all summer. And she said, well done. And off she went. And it just, for me, I remembered standing out because it felt like bullying, and I just hated that. I have always believed if somebody wants to put a flag on their home, if they want to do that and express their identity, that's entirely up to them. But when you start imposing it on other people, that's not what identity is about. And that's the bit that jars with me. But that's the incident in my head that made me step back and say, what are we using these symbols for? Why are we using them to intimidate people in our community? Why are we using them to intimidate people who are coming to do work in our community? That's not what this is about for me. And that was the point where I think my thinking started to change. And the other big thing, I suppose, for me was going to university, because I went to Queen's and I met people not just from all over Northern Ireland, but from all over Ireland who were studying at Queen's. I met people who had come from outside these islands and were studying at Queen's. And it was my first experience of integrated education. It was my first opportunity to sit down with other people who had had a very different experience to me and actually listen to their experience and understand better their perspective, and also recognise that we had so much in common. And I think that for me was really telling. And I suppose the third thing that changed my politics was recognition that I grew up in a really quite deprived neighbourhood in East Belfast. So the area where I grew up would have been kind of fairly old, kind of Victorian terraced housing, built very rapidly to service the shipyard and the rapid growth in industry. And then down further from that was Short Strand, which was a sort of Catholic nationalist sort of enclave in East Belfast. It was very isolated. In my mum's day, the people who lived there would have worked in the rope works alongside her. She had friends, women who worked together. But with the Troubles, that stopped and it was really cut off. And there was a belief in Short Strand that we had it good. And actually there was a belief where I grew up that we had it good. And then you went and you looked and we had the same problems, the same issues. And instead of working together to solve the economic issues that we were facing and try to make life better, we were both being sold a lie that essentially we were better off and we should just keep quiet and keep voting for the people we'd always voted for, and our life would stay better than their life. Actually, none of our lives were really anything to shout about. And I think for me, seeing that very visibly did challenge the kind of political background I came from, because I realised that we weren't better off, they weren't better off. We both needed to work together and try and lift families out of poverty and give them opportunities and do all the things. But the problems on both sides of the peace wall were the same. That really affected me in terms of my own politics, because I think just recognising that for a long time, particularly in unionist communities, people believed that their politicians were looking after them and that they were better off. They weren't. They did have opportunities that their Catholic neighbours didn't have in terms of employment, but it has left them now in a really bad place about education. And so there have been consequences to that, and I think many of them have been negative. So I think all of that kind of started to challenge my views and inform them as I was growing up.
In the story about your mother, there's immense bravery in what she did as a person on her own, standing up to bullies, as you say. And do you think we underestimate the small ways in which people in Northern Ireland find ways to do that, to act in that kind of way over the years, maybe especially during the Troubles, but still?
Yeah, I think those things matter. My mum, if someone from outside our neighbourhood had complained about what happened, that have been dismissed completely, my mum being able to find a way to diffuse the situation in a way with the neighbours, but at the same time to point out the ridiculousness of what they'd done in a way they could understand, I think was quite powerful. It was also quite brave. I mean, these weren't just kids, these were grown men who were trying to intimidate, and she was willing to stand up for them. And I suppose that also influenced me, because my mum was very strong in her views. She was very honest and very open, and never reluctant to share an opinion, whether it was popular or unpopular. And I think she taught me to be the same. She encouraged me to say what I thought and to challenge. And if I saw something I thought was wrong, to speak about it. And I was, from a very early age, just instilled with the belief that bullying was just not acceptable, like it's just not on. And she would always kind of batted for the underdog. So I guess there was a bit of that was instilled in me, in that when I see people, even now, who are vulnerable in our community and, are being intimidated because of their race, their religion, their sexuality, or whatever it might be, it really does make me angry. It's not just something that politically I find offensive. It actually does rile me, because I can't understand the mentality of people who see vulnerability and want to exploit it rather than actually help. And I suppose that's just something that was instilled in me. But yes, I think there were lots of people in Northern Ireland who did really brave things and moved the conversation on in ways that were really powerful. I mean, I always remember when the Enniskillen bomb happened, and it was such a totemic sort of moment. And when Gordon Wilson spoke in that moment, totally honestly and openly forgiving the people who did it, like, that was powerful. It was really powerful, because a lot of people were angry and full of hate and revenge, And the fact that somebody's so close to it was not that, almost modelled a different way to respond. And so I think those acts of courage, and there were people who denounced him for it and criticised him for it, but those acts of courage, it was very hard to criticise somebody that suffered that much for how they respond to it as well. I think those small things, those small challenges in communities, the people who do speak out and say that's wrong, those things have mattered over the years and they have changed people's views. So I am a great believer that small acts of kindness or courage or whatever can change communities, because it just makes people think, it makes people stop and think. And I think sometimes when you get together as a group, you get almost like a sort of mob mentality where people lose sight of the individual, the impact and everything else, and people get carried away with themselves. And sometimes it just takes somebody to stop and say, have you thought about this? And it just brings people back to a bit more humanity.
Thanks. You talked about then going to Queen's and having a different experience, but obviously in secondary school then that wasn't an experience that you had of meeting people from the Catholic nationalist community. I wanted to just pause a minute and think about integrated education, because I know it's been an important issue for you for a long time. It's still the case that only about 7% of school pupils in Northern Ireland are in integrated education. Do you see a bright future for integrated education at secondary level in the North?
I do, and at primary level, and it's something that I'm really passionate about. People will sometimes say to me, why do you worry? I mean, if you go to England, you know, there are church schools there and it's not a problem. But people don't go home at night to communities that are equally segregated, and that's the difference. In Northern Ireland, about 90% of people live in communities that are 90% single identity. So we're talking about levels of segregation probably on the scale of what we would have seen in the southern states in America during that kind of segregation phase. And then children go to school in segregated schools. And I just don't believe that's healthy for a society, because I was able to grow up in some ways, and although my parents, I think, were doing their best to give me a wider view and not to kind of encourage me to be prejudiced and all those things. And nobody in school ever taught me to be prejudiced. Nobody was encouraging us to hate anybody. That's not how it works. But I had no real lived experience of anybody who was distinctly different to me or had had a distinctly different upbringing. So I had never really had friends who were nationalist or Catholic. I had never had the experience of just being around people who had a different upbringing and a different political perspective, a different religious perspective. That just wasn't, it was very homogeneous. And part of the problem with that is you get one set of messages reinforced over and over again, and you don't get any alternative view, and your opinions aren't really challenged. And that isn't real life. When you go out into the world of work, you're going to be mixing with people from all different backgrounds, all different opinions, and you've got to learn how to accommodate difference, how to accommodate that diversity. And the fact that there are many things you have in common with people. You may have some fundamental differences, whether they're religious or political, but you may also have other things that unite you. Love a sport, you know, loving some hobby or whatever it is, having the same ambitions, working in the same office. So there are all those things that bring people together, and it's about how you manage difference. And we didn't really get a chance to learn that in school. And they would do things like, they used to take us in what were called EMU events, Education for Mutual Understanding. It was the first time I was ever stoned on a bus on an EMU trip. So up until then, I was unaware of how hated I was as a Protestant child. Until I went to pick up the kids from St Matthew's Church School in Short Strand. And they were stoning the bus. Some of the kids who weren't going on the trip were stoning the bus, because that's what people did in Belfast when they saw buses in the 70s. And it was, you know, it was weird, but it was also weird, because some of the kids on the school bus from my school were pointing out the window going, that's my cousin. Because they were East Belfast people. People intermarried. People who lived in Short Strand, married people who lived outside Short Strand and came and lived in East Belfast, and their grandkids and cousins that were on both sides of that divide. So it was sort of mad, but it was my first experience. But you would go to the Ulster Hall and sing Christmas carols for an afternoon, and then you would go back home, but you'd never see those people again. I would never see those kids I was on the bus with. There's no relationship. You don't get to know them. You don't get to hear about their home life. You don't get to meet their parents. You don't get to play with them. Or you were bussed out of the area, you did a nice thing and you came back. There's no mutual understanding there. That was just a day out and then you came back again. So there was something kind of fake about it. I always laugh when I see the bit in Dairy Girls where, they try to do the, what's the difference between Protestants and Catholics and all this kind of stuff. But that is what education for mutual understanding was like. You would be taken somewhere out of your own community. You would be thrown into some activity and then you'd all go home again and never see each other again. When you go to an integrated school, you're just your classmates. There's no you're this, you're that. You're in that school, you're doing all the same classes. There's intentionality about it, so they discuss difference, they talk about the fact that there are differences, they learn about that, but it's just as part of being in that class, and they get to know each other and they make friends. And some of the stats that come out at the end, they survey young people in Northern Ireland regularly about their attitudes. Children who go to integrated schools are far more likely to be accepting of having a Catholic friend or a Protestant friend, far more accepting of having a Catholic or Protestant boyfriend, far more accepting of having Catholic or Protestant neighbours, all those sorts of things. When you go outside the integrated system, the tolerance of that drops because there's suspicion where people don't know somebody and can't personalise their experience. There is fear or suspicion. And that's the danger of the division that we have, that it breeds that sense of difference, that it's almost insurmountable. And yet for most of you from Dublin, if you come to Belfast, you're just like, they're all mad. And you see us just as one big collective madness. But we see ourselves as distinct and different and so unique that we can't possibly ever work together. And it's not how it is. So I think integrated education is really important. And I think it has a bright future because I think the Integrated Education Fund has come up with a really smart idea. One of the problems with education, I think worldwide, but particularly in Northern Ireland, is there are so many vested interests. There are so many people who are in education and it's not for children, it's for power, control, all those other things. And Northern Ireland is no different in that, except we have a lot more vested interests. What the Integrated Education Fund has done is a thing called Integrate My School, and it's the parents take the lead. So you can fill in a form to say you want to transform your school to an integrated school. And once a certain number of parents have filled that in, the Integrated Education Fund will come in and help them campaign with other parents. And then once you reach a certain threshold, the school has to hold a ballot. And then if the ballot passes, it has to go to the Education Authority or the School Authority. And we have seen transformation of far more schools in the last number of years through parental choice. Because the problem with parental choice at the minute, how it's interpreted by the Education Authority, is you can have parental choice provided you don't threaten the viability of any other school. So parents can't decide, well, we're not going to send our children to the Catholic school or the Protestant state school. We're not going to send our children there, we're going to send them to an integrated school if it means that either of those other two schools might become unviable. Well, it's bound to happen if parents choose integration. They say over 90% of parents would choose integration if it was an option. The other systems would close. That's the inevitable consequence. But the Education Authority limit it by saying, well, we won't provide integrated education if it's going to threaten any of the existing structures. They also don't assist schools to amalgamate. So we have, at the minute, identified about 14 pairs of schools, one Protestant, one Catholic, in a village where neither of them are viable in terms of numbers. And the solution for that village is a single school, shared and integrated. Because what will happen if they don't do that is those schools will close and those children will be bused to another village to go to school. And eventually parents will say, well, I don't want to live in that village because it's too much hassle, so I'll move to another village, and the village will die. But there's no mechanism. There's nobody with the power or authority to go in and say to a Catholic maintained school and a state school, do you want to amalgamate? Let's look at a process to do this. Because they have different management systems. So unless the management systems want to do it, and even then there are barriers. So we need to change how we do policy and how we do politics in Northern Ireland to facilitate that kind of coming together and that kind of constructive conversation about what would be good for that village, for that town, rather than always looking to what is good for our sector in the education system. And I think that's one of the big challenges that we face is the structures don't really work but the advantage we have is that the parents are really determined. It was parent power that got us our first integrated college in Lycan College, and it'll be parent power, I think, ultimately that will transform the education system in Northern Ireland.
Great, thank you very much. You've talked about your own faith and then your membership of the Church of Ireland when you were younger, Presbyterian Church later, and then maybe drifting away from institutional churches. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts on faith as part of who you are, but then maybe to reflect out a bit on and give us from your perspective a sense of how we should understand the role that faith plays these days in Northern Irish identity, because it seems to me it's become very complicated with, in a sense, particularly on the Protestant side, with the decline of the more established churches and the rise of smaller evangelical congregations. So what's your take on personally, and then maybe stepping out?
Well, I mean, faith plays a big part. It's part of the reason that I'm interested in engaging in my community. When I wasn't a politician, I was engaged in other work through my church and youth work through girl guiding and things like that. So I always believed in service and trying to improve. I was very involved, for example, with international development through my church and things like that. And faith plays a big part in my life. I think religion in Northern Ireland plays a big part in people's lives. I think that's slightly different. I think there's a tendency for people to identify with a religious doctrine, but not necessarily live a life of faith. And I think that there are genuine challenges. I mean, at times I listen to some of the things that are said about immigration and migrants, and I can't reconcile it with how Jesus approached those things in the Bible as a migrant for part of his life. Things that are said about homeless people, and I think about how Jesus wandered around the Middle East for many years preaching and relying on the charity of others. And it doesn't sit comfortably with me. You know, people have a superficial level of kind of religious acknowledgement, but not necessarily a faith that changes how they live. I'm not a religious person anymore, in that I'm not aligned to any particular denomination. I grew up in the Church of Ireland. I moved to the Presbyterian Church, and I parted company recently, well, not that recently, but fairly recently, with the Presbyterian Church on the issues of how they were treating LGBTQ people. And it comes back to that bullying thing again. It just felt to me like we were taking people who were marginalised and on the edge of society and treating them appallingly. And not only that, but bullying the people who were trying to reach them and show kindness and inclusion. And it felt to me a bit like the story in the Bible where Jesus went on to tell the story of the Good Samaritan, where the church had become very pious. It was a collection of people that they approved of and they thought were worthy, rather than a place for people who are broken and need healing and support and kindness and love and all of those things to go. And I just felt so uncomfortable with it. There were a number of incidents that took place, church commissions. I mean, David Ford had an awful time as party leader over equal marriage. There was a church commission. He literally was taken to the church courts in the Presbyterian Church over his stance on equal marriage. At one stage, my husband, who was our church secretary and an elder in the Presbyterian Church, somebody wrote to ask that he be removed as an elder from the church for two reasons, the second of which did make me laugh. The first was his support for LGBTQ people. And the second was him not keeping his wife in order. Which in fairness, our minister said, well, I know you, so I forgive him that one. But in the end, it was all diffused and nothing happened. But it soured things. And in the end, Michael also did stand down because he just felt that it was knee-jerk stuff in a way that, I remember one of the new moderators. There were a number of incidents that happened. There was a new moderator came in, and it was the time where they were doing mitochondrial replacement therapy, and we were dealing with it in Parliament in the UK. So some women can't have children because the mitochondrial cells that the child feeds on in those initial weeks and months of conception are flawed, but they can be replaced. The technology is there to replace them. And the church adopted this really weird thing of calling them three-parent babies, and that this was unnatural. And I said, but when you get a cornea transplant or a heart transplant, you don't refer to that person as a four-parent person, but they have a big chunk of somebody else in them. So how is that? Like, we either reject all scientific advancement and all medical science, or we have to embrace it sensibly. And the bizarre thing was that he had denounced this on the front page of the Belfast Telegraph or something, I think partly because actually churches are really poor at PR, so he hadn't been prepared for the questions he would be asked, and he just said something, but he hadn't spoken to me about it. And, I challenged him afterwards in it, and I said, with all due respect, if I'm going to make a decision, he said that I should have discussed it with my congregation before voting on it at Parliament. And I said, if I'm going to discuss the state of my soul, I will go seek out a minister. But if I'm going to discuss something as technical as mitochondrial replacement therapy, I'm going to go talk to a geneticist. Like, I'm going to go to the right person. I wouldn't get a plumber to do brain surgery. So I'm not going to go to a minister to ask about mitochondrial replacement therapy. But there was something just felt reactionary rather than thoughtful in the approach. And everything is a disaster. It felt like a cultural war being imported almost from the States around some of these issues. And I just felt increasingly uncomfortable. And the point where it tipped for me was when the church said they would no longer baptise the children of gay people. And at that point, I felt, okay, that's it. Like, at no time have we ever said we would reject the children of murderers, rapists, terrorists, you name it. But we're going to do that for people who are gay. And I said, I can't be part of that anymore. And the hounding of people in the ministry who have been supportive of and inclusive in their ministry has, I think, been just appalling. And so I did part company. I think religion and faith play a lesser role than they used to in Northern Ireland. I think observance has dropped dramatically compared to what it used to be. I think a number of scandals, institutional abuse inquiries and so on, all of that has exposed a sort of dark side. And I think that the churches are perhaps not in as strong standing as they used to be. But I also think they've gone through a transformation, certainly on the Protestant denomination side, of becoming very aligned with a very kind of narrow right-wing agenda that doesn't sit comfortably with me, because I don't think it's reflective of my kind of biblical experience in terms of my understanding. And I suppose for me, I just felt at one stage that we were actually at church and it was Communion Sunday, and I just thought, I'm not really in communion with the church. I still love the people in the congregation, I still do. because my own congregation, they were just lovely people. But I just didn't feel I was connected to the church in the way that I needed to be worshipping there on a regular basis. And so I have become a bit of a nomad and a bit homeless. And I sort of go around and go to different places. But I still believe in God, and I still believe in the kind of life that I should live and that it's informed. But I think one of the things that stands out for me is that a lot of people assume that I support things like LGBTQ people in spite of being a Christian, and that I'm in some way leaving my Christianity at the door and I'm doing it because it's political. And it's not that. I do it because I'm a Christian. Because as a Christian, I'm commanded to love my neighbour and to treat them as I would want to be treated. I don't get to pick my neighbours. So I have to love everybody equally and be that person. And I think that a lot of the time it's interpreted, and I know that David Ford found it very difficult, that in some way you're going against your own beliefs if you're doing it for political reasons or populist reasons. Really wasn't about that for me. It's about people I know, it's about friends I have, and I've seen the damage that religious institutions have caused to them by othering them, by alienating them, by treating them with disrespect. And I've also seen some of them lose their faith because of it, which I think is a real shame. And so I guess those are the things I would like to see change. I don't know that religion plays as big a role in the conflict situation in Northern Ireland as it traditionally did, because I don't think it has the same hold on people. I think that's much more a political division, but the sectarian divide is still very much there. It hasn't transformed massively. There hasn't been some kind of paradigm shift where suddenly you have a mix of people who are unionist and Catholic and, Protestant and nationalist. There are small numbers of people who have always fitted in that category, but there hasn't been a sea change of a kind of breakaway from those backgrounds. But there are increasing numbers of people who don't identify with either any religion or with Protestant or Catholic as the primary way they would describe themselves rather than Christian, and also who don't see that as part of the issue when it comes to Irish unity, the UK. It's not really driven by that anymore, I don't think.
The 2022 Life and Times survey would have that group of neithers, as they're sometimes called, at about 38%, which is an enormous number. And I suppose in the political science, there would be a sense that those are actual or potential alliance voters. But 38% is quite a bit bigger than maybe 15, somewhere around 15% you'd be getting as far as preferences or in Westminster elections. So obviously you have a professional interest in that group. How do you understand that 38% or whatever it might be of people who describe themselves as neither unionist or nationalist or equivalent?
Well, I think there are some people who are just disengaged from politics and just don't care either way, and aren't going to vote either. They're just not, politics is not a big part of their lives, and I think that's just the reality. I think in terms of the not Protestant or Catholic thing, I think secularism is on the rise across the world. I think it's interesting you mentioned about the growth of the kind of evangelical, smaller churches, particularly in the Protestant side. And I think that's almost a reaction that people have walked away from the big institutions and are more interested in that relational kind of stuff. So the people who still describe themselves as something tend to be more passionate about that thing rather than people who are just paying deference to something that has always been part of their tradition. And I think that has changed really dramatically. I would argue right across these islands. Northern Ireland is still more religious than most other parts. And it's one of the things we would see is much higher levels, for example, of charitable giving than in the rest of the UK. And a lot of that is fed through church organisations. And there would be lots of other things that you can track that would show that it's still people are much more likely to attend church and things, but it's in decline. I think in terms of the neither, some will just be neither because they're not engaged. there are a large number of people who are neither but will vote down traditional lines. So they may not feel passionately unionist or passionately nationalist in their views, but they may vote along those traditional lines based on who their parents voted for and where they live and those sorts of things. And then there are others, I think, who are more, if you like, actively neither, is maybe a way to describe it, rather than just passively neither. Some people have just rejected the whole thing around politics. But then there are those of us who would be, I would say, actively neither politically. And that I don't, even within the party, there will be people who would be unionist or nationalist. But when you look at the work that John Tong did, it's very clear that they are in a minority, and that the vast majority, that's kind of classic curve, the vast majority are around that neither, that pole, because they've rejected unionism and nationalism as political philosophies that actually will advance society, and are looking for an alternative to that, a third way to do business. And I think that those people will tend to align with Alliance. And that's, I suppose, where we need to close the gap between our current polling and voting levels and that group of people who still are not engaging with us, but are neither. Some of those people will also be Greens. So there's a small, I mean, it's small in Northern Ireland, it's 1% to 2%, but that's another 1% to 2% of people who just don't align along those traditional divisions and don't identify primarily as that. We did the survey that John Tong did that we were talking about. They asked people in Alliance, they did a series of surveys, and they asked them to list their top 10 priorities. And he said the one thing that really shone for him was that there was virtually nobody put a border poll in their top 10 priorities. The constitutional questions didn't feature. They were talking about education, poverty, housing, all of the really practical things. And he said people will sometimes think that we're secretly something else, or that people really, you must be a unionist or you must be a nationalist, you can't have no opinion. And he said when we actually surveyed the membership, you really don't care about it. Like it's not a facade. There's really just no interest in this conversation. Now, that's partially true. I think there are also people like myself and others who do engage in that conversation because we are interested, but not in the same way. We're not driven by ideology. We're interested in what the future will hold, what it will look like, how we can help shape it. But it's not driven by ideology, and I think that's the big difference with the neithers. It's not an ideological decision. It's a decision that they'll reach based on pragmatic and practical considerations, if and when the time comes.
Thanks. And thinking about those constitutional futures and changes, I said to you just before we came in that I wanted to ask you about Brexit, and you did that face. And I suspect that face is long practiced at this stage. So let's try to address it in as positive a way as we can. When you reflect back on the experience of Brexit, do you think from your own personal point of view, has it changed your sense of what Britishness is, or what Britain has come to represent? You think about the other forms of identity that people ascribe to. What are the identity after effects of Brexit, do you think, in terms of how people's way of understanding themselves particularly within Northern Ireland, and then how that might factor out in the future?
Yeah, it has definitely changed perspectives, no doubt about that whatsoever. We saw a massive shift of people who moved from being solidly unionist to really disaffected with unionism over Brexit, who valued, and I think this is something that maybe people didn't fully appreciate, but really valued their European identity as something that, particularly people who are those neithers, who are not kind of driven by unionist nationalist politics, they really valued the European project because it was part of something bigger that we could all buy into, and it wasn't divisive, so we were all part of something bigger. I think for me, the brilliance of what we were trying to do in the European Union was to diminish the impact of borders. I mean, I said earlier, I'm not a natural nationalist of any kind or any description. I think nationalist politics is a road to no town. And from my point of view, what the European Union was about less emphasis on borders and division, more on cooperation, collaboration, working together, harmonising our systems so that the border almost became an invisible thing, that it didn't really affect people's day-to-day lives. And that was true whether it was the border, that I crossed occasionally between France and Germany around Strasbourg when I was an MEP for a very short period of time, or whether it was, the border north-south in this island or whatever. We were trying to get to a point, which I think is the right place to be, where we were working together really collaboratively, really well, with kind of a sense of purpose. And people like that in Northern Ireland. I think that overarching European identity was something that we could buy into, and that we could see the benefit of. And I know people will point out, well, there were also financial benefits, and they were huge. And I'm not dismissing those at all. I mean, the investment that the European Union made in Northern Ireland has never been replicated by any British government. And we're seeing that more and more as what was promised is stripped away, layer by layer, whether it's foreign payments or whatever it is, we're losing that investment. Whereas when it went through Europe, it was multiplied and brought back to Northern Ireland in a way that it isn't through Westminster. But it wasn't just about money. I think that's where people misunderstood it. It was about identity, actually. It was about feeling a part of something bigger. And for me, I mean, I found Brexit I found Brexit almost beyond my comprehension. I could not understand why anybody would want, and particularly why the UK, that had such a good deal, would want to give it up for the unknown. And to listen to people talking about trade deals with Australia and trade deals with some island off the coast of wherever, as if this was the same as our major trade, like the biggest trading bloc in the world, was just, I couldn't practically, pragmatically, intellectually process what was going on. And it just seemed to me it was driven by a combination of British nationalism, wartime nostalgia. I mean, I'm so tired of the sort of references back to the war and all of that. It just missing the point that the whole point of the EU was that wouldn't happen again. So it was actually it was part of the process. There was a nostalgia there for the past, this idea that the UK was too big to be part of Europe when none of the indicators were that was the case. A complete forgetting of the historic context in which Britain entered the EU, which was that it was broken as an economy and the EU was what turned it round. A lack of recognition of the degree of influence that the UK could have in the EU. All of those things just frustrated me hugely. And there was no logic to it. And there was this kind of underlying xenophobia that kind of underpinned a lot of it that I just found really grim. And it was led by people who were disingenuous. You know, they said, oh, we don't want these elites ruling us. And you look at them going, you are the elite. Do you know, it was, and yet people seemed to buy it. And it still baffles me that it was not just an act of self-harm that the UK inflicted on itself and is still reeling from. But for the communities who backed it, it was a massive act of self-harm. They were angry and disaffected with government. And I think the one thing I've learned from this is how important it is to understand where people are and the impact that they're feeling in their lives. It's okay saying the economy's doing well, but if you've got no money, it doesn't feel like it is. If you can't pay your bills, telling somebody GDP's up is not going to help. So you have to understand how people are feeling and living their lives. And I think a lot of people were angry at the government, and their way of kicking the government was to vote for something that they knew the government didn't want. And the government, despite the stupidity of calling the referendum, didn't actually want Brexit. And so that was a way of, well, we'll show you. And the problem with it was that it hurt them most, because those are the communities that will have lost the European funding, that will have lost the opportunities and everything else. And so I think that's, politically, there was a shift. I also think the standard of our politics plummeted. I think once people realised you could put figures on the side of a bus and drive it around London that were pure lies, they realised you could say anything and do anything and you'd never be held to account. And I think our politics actually was tarnished by that. We had years of, politicians standing. You could hear the click in the background of the cameras. It was on television, and them say, no, there's no press here. And it's like, you're denying what we can see, and yet nobody's saying that's a lie. And so to me, politics just took a nosedive, because people realised we can say anything and nobody will really challenge us, because everybody is focused on, well, we have to have political balance. So provided somebody else comes on and says the opposite, we're grand. And that's not how politics should be. There should be fact-checking. People should have to tell the truth. So that, for me, did change my views, because up until then, I felt there was a certain amount of integrity in what Parliament did, on how we operated, that there was a certain level of respect for that. And that went very quickly. I think a lot of unionists who were pro-Europe felt very homeless, because the unionist parties didn't make a strong pro-European case. And as soon as the vote happened, went, well, that's that then, and we'll just have to accept it. And I'm going, no, you can't campaign against it still, because that's politics. You don't have to agree. You have to accept the vote has happened. You have to accept the reality of where we're at, but you can campaign to change how it's delivered, which is what we did. So I think it did change. I also think it changed something in north-south politics quite dramatically, because I think that the re-emergence of what will happen to the border, where will the border be, was a really toxic injection into our politics at that time. I mean, it was another focus on division rather than what we could do together. And I sometimes, probably unfairly, refer to it as we were like the children of divorcing parents almost. The British and Irish government were at loggerheads, and some of our politicians saw an opportunity to play them off against each other to see what they could get for Northern Ireland out of it. And so it infected our politics, things like the DUP being in an agreement with the Conservative Party. And then we would go to a Conservative Secretary of State knowing that they were in partnership with one of our political opponents. And the whole thing became absolutely toxic. In terms of where we're at now, it's not perfect. I would far rather be a member of the EU. I don't think the UK will go back in, because I don't think they'll ever get a deal like the one that they had. I mean, there's no way the EU are going to offer them that again. So it was madness to leave. They left, I always describe it as, we had a racehorse, and Nigel Farage and others came along and said, you can have a unicorn. And what we got was a donkey with a cone on its head. And that's how it feels to me still. It's not what we needed. But from my point of view, I think we need to work really hard on the relationship between London and Brussels. That needs to improve. The relationship between London and Dublin needs to improve, because when those relationships are out of sync, relationships in Northern Ireland are directly impacted by it, and instability follows. And I do think a lot of the instability that we've seen during that period, while it wasn't all entirely Brexit related, it was certainly Brexit adjacent in terms of how it came about, and our inability, I think, to properly process it. I do think relationships are better now than they were. I think Labour have made it fairly clear that they want more alignment with the EU, although they'll not use that language. They're talking about things like a proper veterinary agreement, which is what we articulated in the beginning and was rejected. But also, part of what continues in Northern Ireland politics is that the people who chose this are the people who are angry about the consequences. It's like, it is literally like somebody being introduced to the concept of actions having consequences. And you're seeing it in live time. And it's quite bizarre. You know, I sat in meetings where DUP economy minister would tell us how difficult it was going to be when we had no ESF funding anymore, with no sense of irony that was their choice. And, you know, we see it now about the sea border. I remember doing an interview, and I will never forget it, because it was myself and Ian Paisley Jr. at the time, and we were on a panel pre-Brexit. And I had said I would find it objectionable to have to show my British passport to go to London or Birmingham or Manchester. Why should I have to? They don't have to show their passport to move around freely, and I wouldn't want to. And I'm not a particularly nationalistic person, but why would I have to do that? Why would I have to show my passport to go to Dublin or Galway or Sligo? Why would I have to do that? I shouldn't have to do that. And Ian pulled his passport out of his coat pocket and said, "I am proud of my passport. I'll show it to anyone, anytime." But not if he needs sausages, and not if he needs meat products or plants. And I remember saying to him, the logic of this is, you've got a choice in terms of the border. You're going to police it along 200-300 miles that winds through farms and down shucks and up lanes and all the rest of it. And you're going to have to patrol all that and deal with all the customs along that border. Or you're going to do it at 7 ports and airports. Where are you going to do it? Where are your checks going to be? Like, if you're the government, where are you going to put your customs posts? All along the border, or 7 places that are built for it. And the Irish Sea border, to me, was the most obvious thing. I could see it coming as soon as Brexit happened. And yet nobody else seemed to anticipate that on the unionist side, that was the natural outworking of where they'd chosen to go. We'll have a vote on Monday on the democratic consent motion to consent to the Windsor Framework continuing. Not a single unionist is going to support it. The only good thing that Boris Johnson did, in my view, in his whole time in Parliament, was that he constructed the vote such that it is not a parallel consent vote, but it is a majority vote. And we will have a majority of MLAs. Interestingly, it will be a more cross-community vote than a parallel consent vote, because my vote will count for the same as everybody else's for once. And we will get a majority decision that the Windsor Framework continues, but with absolutely no unionist support. And as a result, we will have to vote on it again in 4 years rather than 8 years. If we could get a majority of unionists to vote for it, it wouldn't come up again for another 8 years, because they won't. We're going to have to do it every 4 years. And that, to me, is just a point of tension that we could do without. Having to have this debate about Brexit forever on a 4-year rolling basis, to me, is not a recipe for stability. So we're still living with the consequences of it. However, in terms of operationally how it's worked, we're surviving. It's not great for the UK economy. It's not been great in terms of levels of funding for Northern Ireland. In terms of European funding, we still have some peace funding, but we're probably the last tranche of that at the moment. But we've lost a lot as a result of Brexit, and most of all, I think we've lost that overarching sense of cooperation, collaboration, being part of something bigger that people could buy into and that could bring them together. And that's the bit that I miss the most, I think, in terms of Brexit.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'd like to leave some time for questions from the audience, if anyone wants to ask a question.
I think, generally speaking, if I'm honest, I think people in the South are just bored with Northern Ireland now. I don't think it's particularly my brand of politics. I think they're just tired of Northern Ireland and, frankly, have bigger issues to deal with. I think at times in Northern Ireland we do think that the whole world revolves around us, And we're indulged in that because presidents parade through and we get all this attention and everybody was talking about us in Brexit and everything else. We're a little dot on the map, and people right across this island have been battling lots of things, COVID and the recovery from that, the housing crisis, all of those challenges, immigration, all of the things that are happening that people are wrestling with. And we're just not relevant to them, frankly. We're a place apart. And in some ways, I don't judge people for that. I mean, people used to be really snide at times about, our secretaries of state and how hopelessly they understood Northern Ireland and how out of touch they were. I can't blame them. I mean, if I lived in Surrey, I wouldn't be taking a great interest in what's going on in Northern Ireland either. It would be a bit like, oh, not them again. So I understand that they don't understand us. And at times, as I think I've said today, I look at us and I don't really understand us either. So there's some of it is just, it's so counterintuitive, it's so not sensible and logical that it frustrates people. So I don't think it's particularly that we're ignored by the media as Alliance. We are a bit, I think, because they want to hear the two sides. And so what does a unionist think? What does a nationalist think? And they forget there's this other big group. And actually, we're the big group they should be interested in. Because if there ever is a border poll, we'll make the decision. Nationalists will vote nationalists, unionists will vote unionists, and it's the people who haven't made their minds up yet that will actually decide what happens. And so in many ways, we're the group people should be most interested in, because we're the ones who are going to be the determining factor when it comes to making that decision. And yet we're the people that they forget about because we're not taking sides on things. I mean, I have done quite a bit of media in the South, but you're right, it tends to be on very specific things. And usually if they can't get a unionist and a nationalist, they'll go to me because they think that that's the alternative to having two. Or they've only got room for one speaker, so they'll get me because I'm neutral. And I'm not neutral. I have lots of opinions. But it's just that's the view, I think. In terms of loyalists, we don't look down on them. I mean, we don't. But that narrative has been peddled now by mainstream unionism. I'll tell you what is looking down on loyalists. So I'll give you an example of this. And these are people, the Loyalist Communities Council, David Campbell, chairs that, former Ulster Unionist, former advisor to David Trimble, and it brings together an umbrella for paramilitary organisations and their representatives, and it was meant to be about transition, but they haven't transitioned. He was in the newspapers the other day saying that about the problems for loyalists in education, and he said the problem is that working class loyalists don't have factories and shipyards to go and work in anymore, and he went on about how this had left them disaffected. And I find that really insulting. Because I grew up in a community, my father worked in the shipyard, my mother worked in the rope works. There's no harm in doing manual labour. There's no harm in working in a factory. But he wouldn't want his son, that wouldn't be his ambition for his son to work in a factory or the shipyard. My dad worked in the shipyard. He lost the hearing in one ear and the sight in one eye working in the shipyard. It wasn't something to reminisce about and see through rose-tinted glasses. It was tough work, and he died young. So I find that patronising. I grew up in those streets, and I studied civil engineering, and I worked as a civil engineer for 10 years before I got involved in politics. I went on to be Lord Mayor of the City of Belfast. I'm leader of the Alliance Party and the Justice Minister. Why can that not be the ambition for young working class loyalist kids? Why is it always factories and poverty level jobs? And it's not Alliance that argues for that. It's unionist politicians. And they always have. Because an educated, switched on, critical thinking population won't serve their purpose. And that's the truth. So I get that loyalists are hostile to me, largely around the flags protest, which was largely orchestrated by the DUP, but brought a lot of loyalists in on that. But we're not looking down our noses at them. I have real ambition for kids who live in that neighbourhood I grew up in. I want them to have the opportunities I have, but what I won't do is patronise them and tell them, yes, you can still paint your paramilitary murals on walls and hang your flags and be hostile and have economic growth in this neighbourhood, because you can't. People won't stop there and shop there and eat there if they don't feel safe. And they don't feel safe with the trappings of paramilitarism all around them. And I tell the truth. Now, they say that's being patronising. And they say I'm looking down on them. I'm not. I'm crediting them with a bit of sense and telling them the truth, which might not be what they want to hear, but it's important. I've moved about a mile up the road into Ballyhackamore, also known as Ballysnackamore, because there's so many restaurants in it. But I went to school there, and I live there now, still just off the Newton Arch Road. I've always just lived off the Newton Arch Road one way or another, my whole life. That neighbourhood is full, it's thriving. There are bars, there are restaurants, there are cafes, there are shops, and it's mixed. It's a mixed area. And people feel safe going out and socialising. And people feel comfortable stopping and parking their car and going in for a meal. You go further down the road and we're starting to see change happen. So as that area becomes kind of packed out almost to the most it will be, you go on down the road a bit and it's starting to spill down onto the Newton Arch Road. So there's some really positive things happening. Lots of little businesses. There's been work done by the East Belfast Association there in terms of C.S. Lewis Square and all those kind of events and things, and that's given some businesses more confidence. So we've got some nice bars. Most of the bars in the Newton Arch Road were pretty much paramilitary no-go areas. Now we have some nice bars and restaurants there as well, and it's spilling down. But the bottom line is that you go another 100 yards down the road and there are murals with people wearing balaclavas and with machine guns. Like, that's not a comfortable space that you could bring people from any part of the city to. And if we want the prosperity that we see in other parts, I want the people I grew up with to have the same opportunities and life chances that I have. I don't want them to have to move to get them. I want them to be able to live where they live and still have access to the same services, the same opportunities, the same quality of education. But they have to accept some responsibility for making the place welcoming, open, shared, being able to accommodate people from different backgrounds, because that's how you make a place prosperous, by making it feel safe and welcoming. And so it is getting better. But I think the real looking down on loyalists is about just trying to confine them all the time to stereotypes. And I don't do that. I have no problem with people being loyalist. I have no problem with people being unionist. But I absolutely have a problem with paramilitarism. And I have a problem with the parasitical impact that it has on communities, whether it's dealing drugs, whether it's extortion, whether it's racketeering, whether it's child sexual exploitation. I have a problem with that, and I will always speak out against it. That's not to say you can't be a loyalist politically, but if you're involved in paramilitarism as Justice Minister and as just somebody who cares about the community, I'm always going to call that out. And that's not looking down on people, that's just being honest. Yeah, we've been watching really closely, and I think the fact that at one stage Sinn Féin were polling around 37%, were looking likely to be the largest party, you know, I think did cause concerns particularly for unionists, because their feeling was that, a bit like we all felt really uncomfortable when the DUP were propping up the Conservatives, we kind of need the two governments to be quite neutral in their engagement with the parties in Northern Ireland and not to become partisan, because when they become partisan, it all starts to fall apart very quickly. So we kind of need that stability, and we had that, I suppose, post the Anglo-Irish Agreement. We got more of that. Then with the Good Friday Agreement, we got it more still. Brexit diminished it somewhat, and now we're hoping to get it back. And particularly, I think, with Labour in London, because the Conservatives were not in the same space as everyone else. I think I'm hopeful in one way. I know that Micheál Martin is somebody who is a proponent of reform. Now, he's not as ambitious as I would like him to be in that space. I would love him to say, right, let's really grasp the nettle and do something exciting here in terms of reform of the Good Friday Agreement. And I could understand before he said, well, we don't necessarily have a trusted partner in the UK government to do this and they will unravel the agreement. I think that was true. I don't think that's the problem now. I don't think Labour would do that. But I think there's an opportunity because, I mean, much as, and I sit in the executive and everything is stable, it's as stable now as it was the day before it collapsed the last time, and it doesn't take a lot to topple it. We have a vote on Monday. We don't know what the ramifications of that will be. I mean, every time we get legislation coming from Europe that we need to ratify, the Unionists will vote against it. And that has an attritional effect on their confidence and how they feel and all the rest of it. It's their choice as well to make an issue of it. I mean, one of the things was regulations around hops. We have no hops growers in Northern Ireland, but it would have actually helped our beer industry, and they still voted against it anyway on principle. So things like that over time can erode confidence and trust. There have been scandals hitting Sinn Féin and the DUP over the last number of months, any of which could have toppled the government. So I would love to see whichever government we get actually grasp the nettle around reform and look at how we make Stormont more stable, rather than wait for the next crisis. Because I'll be honest, I think if Stormont collapses again, it's done. I don't think it will come back. I think the public's patience has been tested to its elastic limit. I think Sinn Féin may be slightly chastened by their experiences over the last while. At times, Michelle O'Neill is very good at rising above a lot of what's going on and presenting very well, and I find her quite easy to work with as a politician. But at times there could be an arrogance to their position. You know, I used to go on Twitter, which is always a bad idea. But you would see a lot of Sinn Féin activists, golden unionists, you know, TikTok, time's running out, you know, it's demographics have overtaken you and all the rest of it. And if you believe in demographics being a straightforward, we'll outbreed you and therefore we will win, then that's fine. But you've got all these others and neithers, and nobody's thinking about where they come from. And increasingly we're seeing people who fall into that category coming from more nationalist and Republican backgrounds, people who that's not their priority. It is their background, but it's not their priority. And they kind of discount that very strongly. So I hope it means that they will be more in the space of persuading rather than pressuring. I also think that, and I mean, I've said this before, I think we need to do a lot of work. I mean, one of the things we learned from Brexit is voting on something when you don't really understand the proposition is insane. And I think what we need to do before we get to the point where we have a referendum, and I know Sinn Féin are calling for a referendum and so on, but we need a proposition. We need to understand how it would work, what it would look like, you know, how we would manage the practicalities of it, because that was never done for Brexit, and it has been disastrous. And I just think that if we are going to embark on that conversation, the first question is about shaping what it is we would be voting about. What are we being asked to vote for, as opposed to being driven by ideology? Let people make an informed choice. But we haven't done the preparatory work yet, and I think that's the bit that's missing. So I'm hopeful actually about a new government, assuming we get one soon. I was told it could be a month yet, so I'm having to be patient because I was hoping to meet my counterpart in the Justice Department, but I think it'll take a few weeks yet. Yeah, I think there is a real challenge. I was being, I suppose, slightly facetious in saying that people just don't care, but there is an element of it that people with busy lives are just not that engaged beyond the things that affect them directly, and often Northern Ireland doesn't. So the times when people in the south look north is when there's a crisis. So when something goes really wrong, they see Northern Ireland because it appears on the news. And the news is invariably bad news. I mean, how often do you turn the television on to hear good news? I mean, it just never happens. And even if there is good news, there'll always be somebody there to pick it apart and tell you what's wrong behind the scenes. So I think there is a bit of that people don't see the normality of life in Northern Ireland sometimes, and also understand some of the challenges. I mean, it's easy to write it off, and I always get quite frustrated at times when I hear, particularly sometimes UK government ministers and so on, talk about Northern Ireland people like we're the problem. Like we're the outworking of their policies in Ireland, and our problems are as much your and their problems as they are our problems. We just happen to be the place where it was concentrated. But we're there for a reason, and it wasn't our choice. The current generation didn't decide we were going to be these people stuck up in the northeast corner fighting out the end of this conflict. So there needs to be a little bit, I think, of understanding that we're a product of where we come from, the complexities that people see, the inconsistencies, the illogical nature of some of our political discourse is a product of where we've come from. But it doesn't mean we will always be like that. We can transcend it. But when people say to me, it's 25 years from the Good Friday Agreement, it should be better now. It's a long time since the Civil War, and yet Civil War politics still predominates in elections in the South. Things take time to change, and people in Ireland have great memories. And that can be a blessing and a curse. We never forget anything. And so actually moving on can be quite difficult. I think given what happened, I think we have come a long way. I still think that there are a lot of risks and vulnerabilities, and we need to work better at trying to manage those. But I don't think, given where we've come from, we should be too hard on ourselves. And I think sometimes we are. But I also think that those around us need to understand how we came to be who we are and their role in that, because I think at times there is this presumption that it was just almost a happenstance that this happened up in Northern Ireland. It wasn't. I mean, this was something that was almost inevitable as a result of policies that were made, and it's something that, particularly when we're dealing with legacy at the moment with the UK government, I have to keep reminding them when we talk about the sensitivity of these issues and everything else. And they are talking in terms, even this week, some of them have drawn a line under it. And I have to remind them, when they talk about legacy and historic cases, these people died while I was alive. This isn't history as in Days of the Raj. This is like, this happened in my lifetime. These people, their partners, their spouses, their children are still alive. And if this was anywhere else, they would be looking for justice. And we can't be treated differently in that way. It's a complex issue, but I think the idea that you can just draw a line under it, you wouldn't say that to any other group of people who had lost family in the last 50 years, just draw a line under it and move on. And you can't do it in Northern Ireland either, just because the circumstances make that an attractive idea. And I do think there's an insensitivity sometimes to how intense the impact on communities was during that period. I mean, I'm really fortunate. My new deputy leader, Owen Tennyson, is first person in political leadership in Northern Ireland to be born post the Good Friday Agreement. He's 26 years old, and he was born the same year as the Good Friday Agreement, but after it. And that's a new generation of young people coming through with no lived experience. Yet his entire growing up and his politics have been shaped by the conflict politics in Northern Ireland. So it's not just one generation on, it will take generations for us to move beyond that. And I think we just need to acknowledge that that's not unusual, and it's not necessarily that we're being particularly weak or incompetent in dealing with it, though I think we could do a lot more to proactively work on reconciliation, understanding, and cross-community, cross-border, across these islands in terms of cooperation and education. I think they're a product of their time, and so in some ways can be quite limited. They do some really good work. I think particularly the bodies do really good work, but it's often behind the scenes and it's invisible, and people don't necessarily attribute it to those bodies. We have a particular interest, obviously, as a party, because for many years we wouldn't have necessarily had representatives in some of them just because of the party size. We now will and do, and that changes things. So I think they're pretty, I mean, I still think they're really important in terms of practical cooperation, bringing people together. The North-South structures more generally, particularly the political structures, are just mired in bureaucracy. I'm really lucky. So justice wasn't devolved with the Good Friday Agreement. It was devolved in 2010, 2011. And so I'm not part of the North-South Ministerial Council. I am a member as a minister, but that's not where my engagement with my counterpart here lies. We do that through an intergovernmental agreement, and it's brilliant because it's devoid of all that bureaucracy. Like if I want to meet, it was Helen McEntee, it was the outgoing Justice Minister. If I want to meet Helen McEntee, I can pick up the phone and ask for a meeting, and it happens. If Andrew Muir wants to meet his counterpart through the North-South Ministerial Council structures, he has to be accompanied. And because he is Alliance, he has to be accompanied by a Unionist and a Nationalist minister to make sure that he doesn't overreach. And if a Unionist goes to meet an Irish government official, a Nationalist has to go with them to babysit them, and vice versa. It's insane. And so, for example, part of the DUP protest over Brexit was that they wouldn't attend NSMC meetings, but they also wouldn't accompany Nationalist ministers, so they couldn't meet their counterparts through the NSMC. Now, theoretically, they could meet their counterparts outside of it, but nobody used that initiative and did that and went ahead with their meetings. But we had really embarrassing things where Nicola Mallon, who was the infrastructure minister at the time for the SDLP, couldn't meet her counterpart, and the meeting was arranged because at the last minute, the Unionist who was accompanying her refused to go. I don't have any of that baggage thanks to the agreement that I operate under. And my officials, we've got lots of working groups on things like domestic abuse and sexual violence, violence against women and girls, cross-border smuggling, drugs and all the rest. And they are really good, excellent levels of cooperation in the justice sphere. I think we could take that more modern interpretation of North-South cooperation and do some reform of what was there through the NSMC, because it is important. The ministers all getting together and talking about things that are of mutual interest and mutual benefit is really important. So I'll give you a tangible example. When I was legislating for domestic abuse offences in Northern Ireland, I spoke to Helen McEntee about ensuring that we had extraterritorial jurisdiction. So somebody who lives in a border community who might be abused on both sides of the border would be able to prosecute on either side of the border. So they could be prosecuted for the offences. And Helen did the same. And the result of that is there was somebody who was convicted recently who had been abusing his wife and subjecting her to violent attacks. He lived on the border with Donegal. 3 of the incidents were in Northern Ireland and reported to PSNI. 4 of the incidents were in Donegal and reported to the guards. And he was convicted in Derry and is in jail. And the whole thing was convicted in one go. He didn't have to be retried anywhere else. Now, that kind of really sensible cooperation just makes sense to me. And it doesn't threaten anybody's identity or culture or anything else. It protects people. And I think we have done some really good work in that space that I think is really important. And also things that people don't see. So I was at Remembrance Day for prison service. And every year, quietly, no fanfare, Irish prisons send up a guard of honour to Northern Ireland on Remembrance Day, and the Director General of Irish Prison Service comes and attends that service. And that's not something that the public will see, but it's something that really matters, because people who work in prisons know it's a very unique and very challenging experience, and they have that relationship built up over many years, and they come every year and they stand with their colleagues in Northern Ireland and remember prison officers who were killed during the Troubles in the course of their work. And I just think those things show how strong those relationships can be. And it's not for attention and it's not for performance. It's because there are real relationships being built by working together on a day-to-day basis on practical issues. And I think if we could get more of that fed back in to the NSMC and less of the sort of performative elements of it, I think it would be much, much better, because at times like Brexit, the need for proper communication, COVID, the need to be able to share information, north, south, east, west, work together, have a plan, that was lacking. I have to be honest, it was a struggle, and it made it harder for Northern Ireland to manage, because if you turned on RTE, schools were being closed. If you turned on the BBC, everything was open, and we were standing in Northern Ireland going, what are we supposed to tell people? Because it's like two completely different approaches, and it made it really difficult for us to be able to navigate our way through something that was really complicated. So I think those relationships are so important, particularly if there is a crisis, that we actually can pick up the phone and say, okay, we need to make decisions on this. What you're thinking at the moment, how can we better align with that? How do we make sure that people feel safe, but also understand how we're handling this jointly and see that cooperation and collaboration? Because for most people who live in border communities, you know, they'll shop on one side, school on the other, house with the border running through the garden, and it doesn't matter to them. I mean, I remember during Brexit, one farmer saying, you know, he would need a licence to transport sheep across the border at one stage. He said, and how am I going to do that? He said, the border runs through my field. The sheep are transporting themselves when they're grazing. And he said, there's nothing, I'm not going to have certificates for that. They're just going to do it. And it's that practical stuff, I think, that, you know, if you don't really understand and work together, you can't work through. I think the relationships are quite good. And as I say, I work really well through the justice agencies. PSNI, AGS do brilliant work together. And I'm really impressed by it. We just need more of that really practical cooperation, because then that builds the relationships that allow you to do the more complicated stuff.
Naomi, thank you so much for coming today and talking to us. It's been wonderful to hear your voice. It's a really important voice. It's a strong voice, and it's given us lots to think about. So you're great to come. Thanks for sharing it, and join me in thanking Naomi for